I look forward, as we catch our breath, to introducing Daniel Whitehead, the Mental Health Ministries, which may be one of the most important vessels, opportunities, resources you will ever be exposed to. I plead with you, and I'll be careful not to use that word too often, because we'll come to funding later on, but the truth of the matter is mental health is endemic. 90%, I think, on one poll in America, at least it's true in Canada, 90% people believe that mental health is an essential concern of that many people. And so that's one of the reasons we have chosen this. Daniel, are you with us?
Hi, Jeremy, I'm here.
Daniel. Daniel is a leader. He's an Englishman, and he is the leader, the CEO of Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries. He's a colleague and a friend. He's been a pastor for over 10 years, and he took a wonderful model, the idea that the church and Christian people should identify and be part of the engaging mental health. And he took the format of the Alpha course. You'll hear more about that later. And there's two series of videos. The resources are absolutely, my wife, who is both a therapist and a spiritual director, used this at a retreat center, Rivendell on Bowen, which Daniel will know of. And the remarkable giftedness, psychiatrists, counselors, therapists, and people who have been wrestling with mental health have been really encouraged, blessed, empowered, and seen the need to speak of mental health and promote mental health well-being through this place. Through Daniel, your creativity, you're utterly remarkable, energetic, enthusiastic, and it's a delight. It's so good for you to be with us today. I thank you, and I plead with us to take seriously the use of these resources in our own lives and in the lives of those we care about, and the churches and communities and denominations that we are part of all over North America and far beyond. Daniel, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jeremy. I really appreciate it.
The conversation about mental health is big. 1 in 4 people will be affected by a mental health challenge at some point. People often turn to the church first for help. Many even reach out to church leaders before they talk to mental health professionals. So what does it look like for the church to care well for those of us experiencing mental health challenges? How do we reduce stigma, which creates barriers not only to diagnosis and treatment, but also to community? How can a church become a sanctuary, a place where people living with mental health challenges can feel safe, supported, and a sense of belonging? The Sanctuary course was created to inspire and equip communities of faith that are asking these important questions. Developed in consultation with mental health professionals, theologians, and people with lived experience of mental health challenges, this free 8-session small group resource explores key mental health topics and examines meaningful ways to support recovery, offer companionship, and promote well-being. It introduces a common language and framework to help build a mental health vocabulary within your community so that honest conversations can take place as we come alongside one another. It's also proven to reduce stigma by changing attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors towards people living with mental health challenges. The Sanctuary course is valuable as a teaching tool for the whole church and is best experienced in small group settings. The Sanctuary course is simple to facilitate. Before meeting, participants read the course book. Then, groups gather to watch a film featuring the story of a Christian living with a mental health challenge and highlighting the insights of experts with helpful biblical integration and ideas for community support. Groups also work through the discussion guide, which contains conversation-starting questions and opportunities for deeper reflection through visual art, poetry, prayers, and spiritual practices. The course is completely free, and all the materials are accessible through Sanctuary's easy-to-use online resource portal. The Sanctuary course is made for anyone, anywhere, whether you're a pastor, lay leader, or passionate about mental health. You don't need to be an expert to begin having important conversations about mental health and faith in your community. Learn more and get started with the Sanctuary course today by visiting sanctuarymentalhealth.org.
Well, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you. I hope you heard that. Did you? You heard that okay. Good. Wonderful. As I said before, I have never been in a Christian environment using technology where it hasn't gone wrong. That's never happened. So you have me to thank for that today. But it is a joy to be with you. I've got I'm going to say 40 minutes now. I'm going to present some things. I'll show you a couple of other little films as well. And then we'll have a chance to debrief some of the things I'm going to share. I know there's going to be a response. And then we'll have a chance to do some Q&A to debrief further the things I'm going to share with you. But let me start with a little bit of my own story. And then we'll jump into some theory. And I'll share a couple of models for understanding our own mental health and well-being. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the ways we can respond. So my story is I was a senior pastor of a church for 8 years. I was a youth pastor for 2 years before that. And there was a point in leading a church when my wife turned to me one day and said, "I cannot remember the last time I saw you smile." And I realized in that moment, it had been at least a year since I'd felt any emotion. I was numb. I was emotionally spent. And the saddest part about that, aside from the fact that I could be a pastor for a year and get away with it, as it were, without feeling anything, the saddest part was I had absolutely no framework, no language, let alone any self-permission or explicit permission to share what I was going through. So I moved to Canada for a year, and that was 8 years ago. And I am an Englishman, as Jeremy said, but I'm also now a Canadian. So I have the pleasure of the honor of being a dual citizen. One of the things I would say from the outset is I'm not clinically trained, but I am theologically trained, and I do have lived experience of living through my own mental health challenges. And at Sanctuary, we say the voice of lived experience is such a key and important voice for us to listen to and to listen deeply to. So when I moved to Vancouver, after 2 years of being here, I applied for a job with a small nonprofit called Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries, which was doing work in person for churches in and around the BC Lower Mainland. And remarkably, over the last 4 years, we've moved from being a localized organization to being an international one. We have an office in London, England. We've just set up a charity in the US. And we've gone from 2 part-time staff to over 20 staff. And our budget is times 11 in the last 5 years. So I think this is revealing or is indicative of what's happening in this conversation in the church, which is increasingly, this is a conversation people are realizing that they need to have. And Sanctuary was born actually 12 years ago, and it was created by 2 chaplains who are working for Vancouver Coastal Health, who in their work with churches found that across the whole ecclesial spectrum, all churches felt inadequate or unable to offer support to people at a point of mental health crisis. There wasn't a framework, there wasn't a language. What do we even do with this subject? Where do we begin? And it was that created Sanctuary's work. And I'll briefly mention our founding director, who I took over from, who was one of those 2 chaplains, the Reverend Dr. Sharon Smith. Sharon was an occupational therapist for 20 years. She did a double master's in theology. She got ordained in the Anglican Church. She did a PhD on the intersection of schizophrenia and spirituality. So she has this clinical, theological, priestly research background. And the 5th strand of how she held this subject when she founded Sanctuary was that her husband, Alex, died by suicide about 15 years ago. So she also brings this lived experience piece. And at Sanctuary, our work is informed from those various strands. We say we need all of these strands bringing to bear on a framework and a way of thinking about this subject. And that's why we created the Sanctuary course, which we launched in 2018. The Sanctuary course is like a mental health alpha course, as Jeremy said. And to date, it's been used in over 60 countries and used by over 200,000 people with virtually no marketing budget. So word of mouth has been really valuable to us. And we've got to work with some pretty cool people along the way, which I'll mention as we go. So let me start by sharing a few things. You know, my own beliefs about persons are that we are fundamentally relational beings. Biblically speaking, we see this in the Genesis narrative, where God creates a solitary human form, but then breaks the form in 2, and from each half makes 2 people that in their rejoining enter into the act of creating by producing more people who enter into the community. So the story that tells us why we are here says that we are made for relationships, by a relationship, out of the fruit of an intimate relationship of trust and vulnerability. And we also see this in the doctrine of the Trinity. God is a relationship. We are made in God's image, and therefore relationships are central to who we are, and they're central to what we are. Relationships define us. I mean, try being a person without any relationships. And to state the obvious, your well-being would suffer if you try to be a person without relationships. So relationships are central to us realizing well-being. If you take relationships away from a person, just watch what happens to them. And I don't think it's possible to experience well-being as a human being without good relationships. In fact, the doctrine of the Trinity is necessary, because if there is no relationship in the Godhead, how can true love be expressed? Love has to have an object, an other. And so love and relationships are central to us being persons. There was a study done, funnily enough, in Vancouver a number of years ago, where they took a rat and put it in a cage and gave it 2 sources of water. They gave it pure, clean water and water laced with a drug, with an opiate. And they observed which water source did the rat drink. And the rat drank the drug-laced water dry before it touched the other water. And they said, oh, this is very interesting about addictions. And then one of the researchers said, well, it doesn't seem like a fair study. So let's give the rat everything it needs, and then let's run the test again. So essentially, they gave the rat other rats. They gave the rat relationships. They also maybe gave it a training wheel and comfortable nest, but whatever they did, they gave the rat everything it needed to be well. And sure enough, every single rat drank the pure water and ignored the drug-laced water. So if it's true that rats are relationally defined, it is definitely true that people are relationally defined. And when we talk about relationships, we talk about, or I talk about 4. A relationship to God, self, others, and creation. If there are any more, please let me know. And so to be rightly related to God is predicated on the quality and depth of these 4 relationships. And when barriers get in the way of any of these 4, to some degree, we're out of sync with God's kingdom. And so we are relational beings made in the image of a relational God, made for relationships, and to bear God's image is to be committed to the vocation of relationships. Similarly, as people, we are biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. We call this the biopsychosocial spiritual model. Now, historically, medical science has acknowledged the biopsychosocial model, though in recent years there has been more accommodation of the spiritual nature of persons. So again, in this model, we see 4 aspects of our personhood which all interact or relate to each other. After all, we are relational beings who require a relational framework to make sense of who we are. So each aspect of ourselves impacts the other. Your spiritual life is going to flourish if you've had a good night's sleep, you've got a full tummy and a warm environment to live in, a good network of friends, and you're not experiencing any physical, biological pain in your body. Your spiritual life has the best chance of succeeding. And it's true in all of these ways. Each aspect interacts with the others. So let's talk about mental health. Now that I've built that framework of where I'm coming from, how I understand a person to be, let's talk about mental health. Well, what do we mean by mental health? The World Health Organization defines it as this: a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. You'll actually see another definition that we like at Sanctuary from the Public Health Agency of Canada. They describe it as the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges we face. It is a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. And so at its most basic and essential, mental health means emotional, social, and spiritual well-being, and being able to cope with the normal stresses of life. Now, there have been times when people have said to me, well, but the Bible makes no mention of mental health, to which I must concede that the term mental health is a modern term, and nowhere in Scripture does it use the term mental health as a modern term, just as in the same way that nowhere in Scripture does it use the term Trinity. Now, if I were to say, well, the Trinity isn't in the Bible, I hope your response would be, well, the word isn't, but the reality of it absolutely is. You see, once you have the doctrine of the Trinity, you see the Trinity in all the pages of Scripture. It's like you're given the glasses to see it. And the same is true of mental health. The minute you have the concept, you see it throughout the pages of Scripture. Now, as Christians, the biblical concept that seems closest to what we mean by mental health is shalom. As many of us will know, shalom means peace, but this Hebrew word used in greeting and bidding farewell has a much richer, deeper meaning than just peace. Shalom signifies completeness, soundness, welfare, peace at the core of everything. The concept can be applied to peace between individuals and nations, but also to internal peace within an individual. And it is this sense of internal peace that is most relatable to the concept of mental health, which can be most simply defined as a positive sense of emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. Now, mental health is characterized by a number of things. Here are a few little clues. Self-awareness. Do we recognize and develop our strengths so that we can reach our full potential? Resilience. Are we able to bounce back from hard times? Balance. Are we able to juggle the many aspects of life? Flexibility. When problems arise, can we change our expectations of life, others, and ourselves to solve the problem and feel better? And the ability to enjoy life. Can we live in the moment and appreciate what is happening right now? All of these 5 are indicators. If we're not doing so well in these 5, it's an indicator of where our mental health might be at. Now, we can also think about mental health using a continuum model. And I want to introduce you to the work of Dr. Corey Keyes, an American psychologist, sociologist, and mental health promotion researcher who developed a model of mental wellness called the mental health continuum. Here is the continuum. Now, on the vertical axis, you'll see mental health from flourishing or thriving to languishing or surviving. Now, mental illness also exists on the continuum on the horizontal axis from no signs or symptoms of mental illness on the right to severe mental illness on the left. Now, by mental illness, I simply mean a condition that meets the medical standards as laid out in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is the book that doctors use in North America to diagnose a mental illness. Now, in his research, Dr. Keyes found 2 groups of people to be of particular interest, as they don't fit the one-dimensional illness-health continuum. I don't know about you, but I was implicitly shaped growing up to believe that there is a straight line, and at one end is mental health, and at the other end is mental illness. But Dr. Corey Keyes found that this simply can't be true because of these 2 groups. The first group represents people who are languishing in their mental health, but don't experience mental illness. That was 9.5% of people. So they would be in the bottom right quadrant of the continuum in front of you. They would be surviving without illness. The second group had been diagnosed with a mental illness, but nevertheless had a moderate level of mental health. That was 14.5% of people, represented in the top left quadrant, thriving with an illness. So 24% of people surveyed simply didn't fit a straightforward mental health or mental illness category. He found that people could be languishing in their mental health without a diagnosed mental illness, and he found that people could be flourishing in their mental health with a diagnosed mental illness. In this model, mental health is not the absence of mental illness. Similarly, shalom is irrespective of our biological, physical situation. To know the peace of God in all seasons and stages of life is a profoundly biblical concept. So you could have perfect biological health. You could, in fact, be an Olympic athlete at the top of your game with a gold medal hanging around your neck. But if you don't know the peace of God, how healthy are you? Conversely, you could have less than perfect biological health. You could have a diagnosed mental illness. But if you know the peace of God, then you can know shalom. So perhaps the question to ask is, who is truly healthier according to a biblical definition of health, encapsulated in these ideas of shalom? Encapsulated in this idea that we are relational beings made for relationship, and relational quality, relational depth is ultimately the arbiter of well-being, the arbiter of health. Our culture is so fixated on the biomedical model. We've literally reduced ourselves to lumps of meat that can be treated and cut and prodded until we're better. And with the greatest respect to the medical profession, for which I have a huge respect for, I've been drawing deeply from the medical profession for 41 years. I'm very grateful for it. This is not to denounce the work of doctors. We believe the doctors have a key role to play, but we also believe there are other things that have a key role to play in a person's well-being. It is not simply the role of doctors to ensure that people are well and healthy. It's the role of the spiritual community too. So we are all on the continuum. But mental illness is undoubtedly an experience that makes flourishing more difficult. And often people who are flourishing and living with a mental illness have a lot to teach all of us about how to be well, because they generally have to work so hard to get there. They've had to be intentional about who they surround themselves with, who they distance themselves from, what they do, what they eat, exercise, sleep, doctors, medication, therapists, psychologists. They've had to think deeply about cultivating a rhythm of life that allows them to experience well-being, or shalom. So mental health is not static. All of life is a journey back and forth and around on this continuum as we respond to the stresses in life. I think when we look at this continuum, we think of the pandemic and we think collectively the whole world took a big step down the continuum in the midst of social isolation that came with the pandemic. But of course, sometimes we move up and down this continuum in the course of the day. We also move up and down it during the course of our lifetime. There are seasons, and many of us are in a difficult season in the context of the global pandemic. So there is no us and them when we speak about mental health. It involves all of us, directly or indirectly, at some point during our lives. And remember, all of us are somewhere on this continuum all of the time. It is all of our business. And all of us in our languishing state, whether we have a mental illness or not, may feel a sense of social isolation, disconnection, or dysfunction. And all of us will need information, educational resources, and support to flourish once more. More than this, we need relationships, relational depth to help us recover flourishing mental health. You see, one of the main challenges with languishing mental health is that it isolates. It often removes us from relational depth. It predisposes us to being disconnected. And when we are scared to talk about mental health, maybe for good reasons, we allow disconnection and relational distance to run rife. We ourselves suffer, and actually those around us suffer, because very often those people are suffering too. So when we fail to speak about our mental health, isolation can ensue. And it's especially important that we find ways to speak about it in the context of our faith with others who also need to hear that they're not alone in their suffering. If we only tell stories and testimonies of, I was suffering, but now I'm healed, it can cause those among us who have known lengthy and debilitating mental health challenges, maybe for their whole lives. It can cause them to experience further isolation as they encounter the debilitating effects of stigma. It's important that we speak up in the midst of the murky, grey, liminal phases of life, because God can be found in these phases too. We just may have to look a little harder to find him. So, question I want to look at now is, why is it that one person develops a mental illness while another person under the same life circumstances does not? That's a question we often get asked at Sanctuary. And here's a very simple model to help us conceptualize why this is. The stress vulnerability interaction can help us to understand. On the x-axis, there's personal vulnerability, which refers to our basic susceptibility to mental health problems and mental illness, determined by our genetic makeup and our early life experiences. Our early years shape us and can lead to the development of vulnerabilities, but our entire lifespan is one where change can happen, and we may be more or less vulnerable at certain times of life for a range of various holistic reasons. On the y-axis, we have stress, which refers to the challenges faced in our lives. Now, biological vulnerability and stress are influenced by several other factors, not exhaustively, including alcohol and drug use, medication use, coping skills, social support, meaningful activities, and a host of other things. So, for example, someone may have low vulnerability. They may be 20% on the x-axis, so they can handle much greater stress, up to 80% on the y-axis, before they enter into potentially psychological ill health. Now, compare this to someone who is more vulnerable due to their genetics, family history, early experiences, and current life situation. They may be 90% on the x-axis, so something that's even mildly stressful, just 10% intensity on the y-axis, can push them over the line into psychological ill health. If your personal vulnerability is very high, it can take very little stress to tip you into psychological ill health. So how is it that something so little tips that person into illness? Well, they have a different capacity to you. They have different life experiences than you. And very often the only difference between me and someone living on the streets addicted to a substance is relational depth, is a loving, supportive family and community that have been there for me when I've encountered struggles and would be there for me if I encountered struggles today. And they were especially there for me in my formative years. In many ways, that's really the only major difference. It's relationships, it's connection. I was confronted with this harrowing thought that Gabor Mate, I'm sure many of you know who he is. He's a psychologist from Vancouver. And for 20 years, he ministered on the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is known as the poorest neighborhood in Canada. I was told there are thought to be as many as 10,000 drug addicts that live in that small part of town. And Gabor Mate said in his 20 years of working on the downtown east side, every single person who's addicted to a substance that he ever met, every single one of them have been sexually abused as a child, without exception. So again, it highlights this point. Very often, the only difference is that I've had good relationships that can hold me and support me, and other people haven't. Relationships are central. And of course, our capacities to cope with stress can change over time. And we can learn to understand our capacity and be more boundaried in protecting ourselves from tipping over into psychological ill health as we learn to listen to our bodies, our emotions, and our mental health. Now, that's a lot of theory, and hopefully it's a foundation for us to understand our own lives, and it hopefully reveals some of the reasons we may be struggling at this time, where relational dissonance and external stressful factors can coalesce and gradually move us to a place of languishing, and we don't even notice it. I want to briefly conclude this formal part of my presentation before we get into response and Q&A, just in the next 5 or so minutes, by talking about a really important subject that I don't think is spoken enough about in the church, and that is self-care. You know, when we look at the holistic reality of our personhood, just to remind you that we are relationally defined by relationships to self, God, others, and creation, and that each of these relationships is interconnected and dependent upon the others, that when one is diminished, the others are diminished, and similarly, when one is strengthened, the others are strengthened. So perhaps the first thing to say is that self-care is not a selfish act. It's in fact an act of stewardship, of caring for the good gift that God has given to this world, and that is you and me. If we acknowledge and celebrate the sanctity of human life, then that includes your life. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, a scribe asks Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus' response is, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. And so self-care is a command from Jesus. Treat others well, treat yourself well, treat God well. And these relationships are interconnected and contingent. You cannot have a great relationship with God if you don't have a great relationship with others and yourself. You can't say, oh, I have a great relationship to God and to others and to creation, but I hate myself. This self-hatred impacts and shapes those other relationships. And you are a part of God's good creation. You're a person made in God's image. You have immense value and worth and are worthy of care. And so self-care is a command. It's an action that emphasizes and lives out our valuing of the sanctity of human life. And it's also being a good steward of what God has made and has declared as very good. And pragmatically speaking, we can say that the principle of we cannot give out of what we ourselves do not possess first is true. If we are practicing self-care, we are positioning ourselves to be most effective for God in the care of others, in the care of creation, and in the pursuit of an ever-deepening relationship with God himself. So what is self-care? Well, self-care is simply the act of intentionally caring for yourself. Many people tend to think of being pampered at a spa. I mean, that might be part of it, but I think self-care is something more profound and deeper than just what could often seem like a more superficial act. Many of us live in a Western culture which has dominant narratives around a vision of human life that is preoccupied with a more utilitarian approach to life. Our value is often attached to what we can produce and what we can earn. Independence is held up as the ultimate goal of humanity. However, the Bible paints a different picture, that we are not here for utilitarian purposes, but rather we are here for relational purposes. And contrary to productivity and busyness, our value is more defined by relational depth. Our higher goal is the goal of interdependence, which takes time. Japanese theologian Kitsuki Kuyama wrote about this in his book, The 3 Mile an Hour God. where he posits that when love was incarnate among us in Christ, he moved at the average walking speed of a human being, which is 3 miles an hour. So love has a speed, and it's slow. So when we approach self-care, many of the implicit utilitarian approaches to our lives, fast food, quick shower, punishing exercise routines, can actually strip any sense of self-care from these activities. When, of course, all of these things can actually be redeemed as acts of self-care if we listen to our bodies and our minds, and we intentionally pursue to do these things with a disposition of care, which could look like taking a long bath, not just a quick shower, or going for a walk up a mountain, not just pounding a treadmill, or eating slow food and sitting down without screens and eating in the company of others. To say no to other people's expectations could be some ways of practicing self-care, which actually isn't to denounce that sometimes we need to speed up because life is like that. I have 2 children. I have a home to look after. I have a full-time job. My wife works. Sometimes life is like that. But it's a disposition and an intention that says, when I'm able, I will practice caring for myself because I'm worth it as an image bearer, and I must steward what God has given me, and because Jesus says I should. Self-care practices will look different for all of us. In fact, for some of us, self-care will look like pounding a treadmill at 5 a.m. If that's your thing, go for it. But the key part is to acknowledge the care of our soul. How do you restore your soul? Like practically, what do you do that brings you life? And that's a good question to ask ourselves. And once you can identify what that thing is or what those things are, ask yourself, when was the last time you did those things? The Sabbath was given as a means of slowing down and acknowledging a time each week, a rhythm that wasn't governed by linear time, but a time that was governed by God's time, a time when we can slow down and acknowledge our humanness, our creatureliness, and rest in the knowledge that God is in charge and life is sustained by him and not me. I would suggest crafting rhythms of self-care is a profoundly godly activity, which we see in the gift of Sabbath and in the way that Jesus ministered. And I think self-care is one of the most important acts of discipleship that we can cultivate and advocate for in the context of the global pandemic and the ensuing mental health crisis that many are experiencing, and many more are sadly likely to face in the coming days as the full trauma of this event takes effect. Now, as bleak as that sounds, I want to finish my formal presentation on a more hope-filled note. There was a time a few years ago when an intern joined our organization and we explained the mental health continuum to her. And after we'd drawn it on a whiteboard and explained it, she paused and said, "Can I add one thing to it?" And she stood up, took a pen and drew a big circle around it. And she said, "The circle represents God." This was a simple yet profound way of making absolutely clear the truth that all human experiences are valid in the sight of God, and that God is indeed available to all human experiences at all stages of the mental health continuum. When I saw the circle, I got very excited and I suddenly said, wow, you've inadvertently made the continuum into the Celtic cross, this ancient symbol that speaks to the truth of every moment that the cross of Christ speaks to all human experiences and all creation. As we see this image of the cross like crosshairs pointed at the center of the world, it's a reminder to all of us that wherever we find ourselves today, the cross can endow us with a true and genuine hope that says, wherever you are his, and he is with you. You haven't fallen off the wagon, your story counts, and together through a process of recovery, it is possible to discover shalom once more. I understand as part of these days, you're going to do the wonderful mental health first aid course, which we are huge fans of. One thing I would say about that course is it is there to help you deal with a crisis, which is so important. And I think the perfect blend of that biomedical approach to help you know what to do in a crisis, coupled with Sanctuary's more holistic approach that sees this vision of hope that people can flourish if they're given the right surroundings, is just a potent combination to help a community be ready to know how to support each other. But my hope for you, for all of us, is that we'll press into our relationships to self, others, creation. So glad that Catherine Hayhoe is going to be with you, creation, and to God, because to attend to these relationships is to live out a life of peace, a life of shalom. So I'd now love to just show you another quick 2-minute film This is a trailer for our course. And then as Jeremy asked me to, I'll then spend like 3 minutes sharing about future resources coming out in the next 18 months. And then I'll conclude this portion. So this is a trailer for our course. This is the Sanctuary course.
Something had happened that triggered so much anxiety for me that my mind couldn't stop, and I was getting increasingly depressed. I felt like life was about to end.
I was struggling with anorexia and bulimia. I was so broken.
I'm not in any danger, and I'm just breathing like something bad has really happened. I thought, I'm always sad.
If you dig deep, there'll be this river of sadness that flows underneath everything.
Sense of the world closing in on me. Horrible, horrible experience.
I started to have delusions. I was not reading reality properly. I was really scared.
I thought, there's no way out of this.
It's hard to see a way that this could be different, but hang in there, get help, because it really can be different.
The way I performed or looked externally didn't seem to align with what other people thought depression looked like. They're like, oh, well, you're okay. Oh, well, you're in school. Oh, you're getting A's. You're fine.
Culturally, mental health issues is just not recognized in the Asian American experience. There was certainly a kind of a stigma attached to it.
I felt so much shame. I couldn't let somebody else into that world.
It's critical to normalize. Don't stick our heads in the sand and not recognizing there is someone in your congregation that is dealing with some issue related to mental health.
We all need to lament together, articulating our sadness and recognizing that even in our sadness, God is there.
Your struggles, your suffering, your diagnoses do not exclude you from belonging. Those things are welcome to be talked about.
Resist the temptation to seclude, to stigmatize people experiencing mental health challenges. Listen deeply, come alongside, and treat as a holistic, multifaceted person.
Mental health is important because it cuts to the very heart of our experience of being human beings.
Do some work and do some learning. Find empathy and compassion for real people having real experiences.
When there is a hand that can guide you through God, it will be inspiring to know that there's someone there who may be able to help you.
God is here, and I think a really good church community would say, and we are here.
Okay, so there's a Sanctuary course, which is downloadable for free from our website. All of our resources are free. You're thinking, what's the catch? There's no catch. We want to help the church. This is our remit for existing. Let me briefly touch on a few things we have coming out to whet your appetite. Next month, we're launching a new film-based resource called When a Loved One Dies by Suicide. It's based on a short book, and it's created in partnership with the Catholic Association of Mental Health Ministers. It's a short book that follows the lives of 7 families across America who have lost a sibling, a parent, or a child to suicide. It's a resource that is helping to destigmatize and to offer support and comfort to people who've been affected by this subject. It is distinctly Catholic in feel because we've created it in partnership with the Catholic Association of Mental Health Ministers, but nevertheless, it's an important resource and one that brings the subject of suicide into the forefront of the conversation, which is pretty unique in the context of the church, at least. So that comes out next month. We then launch 2 resources next spring. If the Sanctuary course is like our Alpha course that builds the framework and the language and helps the community know that this is a safe conversation, knows how to think about it, we're developing the Beta course, which will be helping churches to develop a mental health ministry. What do we do next? How do we build on this and continue to create a culture? Those resources for the Catholic context and an ecumenical context will come out in the spring. We're also launching a podcast series in the spring with one of our ambassadors, Dr. Hilary McBride, focusing on spiritual trauma, people who've been traumatized in the context of their faith. That will come out. We also are launching an album with the Porter's Gate. The Porter's Gate, their next album will be called Sanctuary Songs. So we're creating music that will help the church to put words to sing about this subject. That will come out in May. We're also releasing a documentary on the making of that album, because that in itself is quite a healing journey, as we're finding out as we go through that with the Porter's Gate. We're also launching our first module. Sanctuary, in response to the feedback of people who've used our course, are creating modules on specific experiences. So depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. We'll be taking a deeper dive into subjects like these. And the first module should launch in the next year. And then two more exciting things. By January 24, we will launch the Sanctuary Youth Course. So that's getting close to being filmed. That will come out by January 24. And we're also in advanced discussions with a major international publisher on creating the Mental Health and Wellbeing Bible. And Sanctuary would create the written content that fits around the biblical text to help people cultivate a rhythm of well-being as they read scripture. So there's a few projects we're working on. If you want to stay aware of those, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Join our newsletter from our homepage. You can just go down and click on that. And before I finally conclude, perfectly on time, of course, never in doubt, I'm going to play you one very short film, just a minute long, from our ambassador. So, sorry, our patron. This is our charity patron. Here we go.
I'm Justin Welby, and I'm one of the millions of people in this country who has depression. There are many of us who live with mental ill health. For some people, it's intermittent. For others, it's always there. We are in the church. Some of us even lead the church. We serve in whatever way God calls us. I am delighted that the Sanctuary course is helping churches start conversations about mental health and reduce the stigma attached to illness. We must all get better at talking about this. I didn't used to talk about my experience, but now I do, because I've learned that talking helps me to make sense of what is happening and makes room for others to acknowledge and understand what is happening to them and those they love. These free resources will help all of us, ordained or lay, whether we've been in the church for 5 minutes or 50 years. I encourage you to talk, learn, pray, share, and care about this. Whatever your church and wherever you live, it matters. May God bless you.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for listening. Not that you have much say in that, but thank you for listening. I have concluded, and Jeremy, I think you're going to take over from here.
Yeah. For some things, there are no words. Thank you so very, very much. I will say one phrase. What you've heard about the blend, Yvonne's course and Sanctuary, is just true, true, true. And I would just say one phrase: do not turn away from this. Don't say to ourselves or to others, we've been here in this presence, we've talked today, and now we can say we're done. We are not. We have only begun. We've only begun. I've asked Cheryl Ann Beal, Director of Clergy Formation and Wellness from Atlantic Baptist, to respond to Daniel just for a few minutes, and then we'll open it to questions. Thanks very much, Cheryl. And
good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. Daniel, wonderful. I am so excited. And I'll tell you why. We as a denomination have just started to look at soul care as being of central focus for us. And so just launched the Sozo Center for Soul Care. And God is doing something that to tell us that we need to be focused on our well-being, our mental health. And what you guys have done is absolutely wonderful. And when I think what came to mind is it gives us permission to be human. For so long, the church unintentionally has not given people permission to be human. To be human is to be limited, to have challenges, to be broken, all of these things. And what you're doing is saying, it's okay. God's got us. And in community and in relationship, we can bless one another to be fully who we've been called to be. And I'm very excited about what you're doing. I just found out about your ministry. So this is very exciting. And I think that
Amen. Sherland, you've frozen. What's the suggestion, Cliff? Reboot, restart? Sherland, we've lost you. Much as okay. Sherland, thank you so very, very much. Just as she might be trying, just want to say two things. What Daniel said about the blend, of course, Yvonne's course, there's still room and capacity to sign up. You need to do a little bit of homework if you want to be online with that. Contact Zoe, just go actually in the chat and connect with Zoe in that way. And also the grant writing thing, both those are open and available. I'm just going to wait about 30 more seconds. We're ending the business meeting tonight at 5:30, but if you want to stay around and chat and do things like that, we're just going to order in some sushi and some pizza through contact and book them. I understand that, but if you're going to be there, you know, parts of this, carbohydrates, is sign that sheet, okay? And if we've got a bit of a group, then we'll do that. We'll stay, we'll stick around because the restaurants around here are interesting and expensive and crowded. Let's take some questions. Sherland, if you can hear me, thank you so very, very much for that just endorsement beginning. And that even there are people out there, denominations out there that look after formation and care. And that even though you have done that, and I've been mentored by you in other contexts, that this adds to what you offer and I am deeply grateful. Formation and wellness indeed. Let's take questions which people can, Cliff and I are experimenting with this. People can unmute themselves and ask the question. If you ask the question here, I'll ask you to come up or you can shout it out, I'll repeat it. But let's just go online for the first question for Daniel. Daniel, just remarkable. Thank you very, very much. It's an invitation to a long-term relationship with you and Sanctuary, which I am sure many of us in the room will engage in. Question from online. Anybody in the room then? Do come forward if you like, or just call it out and I'll repeat it. Yes, yes, please. So no, come to the microphone. Actually, I'd love people to hear you fully. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'm Sano. I'm the pastor of Phalam Baptist Church and Associate General Secretary of Chin Baptist Association North America. And just raise my hand first so that I can get a chance to know my question, you know, the answer of my questions. And it's really amazing, and I should have attended this kind of training much more than this. And when I hear these presentations, and it's come to my mind, and I would like to ask these questions. And in our church members know that someone is suffering from mental illness, but that person doesn't accept it. And that person doesn't come to me or to church leaders or other outside professional help for help. And so, but the way that person relates with other people and his parents is very, very difficult. And so I don't know how to help. And what is the way to help that kind of people who doesn't accept that they have mental illness or depression, but other people notice that. So how do we approach that person and help? That's my questions. And thank you for the wonderful lecture.
Oh, thank you. No, that's such a good question, and a question that is so common. What do you do for someone who is suffering, and they may not even be aware of their own suffering? I think if we think about someone who isn't a person of faith, I mean, like they don't know that they need Jesus. How do we help them find Jesus? Well, we get around them as a community. We build trust with them. We hopefully let them see what a spiritual community looks like and see how good it is, so that they get drawn into the story of God and his peoples. And I think we can take a similar approach. The challenge is, and obviously if someone is at risk of harming themselves or others, you need to, as you'll find out in mental health first aid, you need to contact the relevant authorities. But if someone is languishing in their mental health, maybe they're exhibiting signs of depression, which obviously only a doctor could diagnose that. But if someone is languishing and they're not able, for whatever reason, to accept that, I think one of the best things we can do is to model vulnerability as a church, to not so much focus on that person's experience, but focus on our own, and make this a safe subject, a destigmatized subject, so that when the person is ready, whenever that might be, they can say, or they can own this without feeling any shame or stigma. The Sanctuary course is great at doing that, in that it simply is a small group resource that gets people talking about mental health, and very quickly people in the room will realize, I know people that do it because they go for their uncle or their friend. Oh, my uncle has depression, or my friend has anxiety, I'm going to go about them. And they realize in session 2 that they're not there for their friend or their uncle, they're there for themselves, because they realize that we all have mental health. And I've never met a person who planned on getting a diagnosis of mental illness. I've never met a person who planned on getting a diagnosis of, for instance, bipolar 1 disorder. That's normally a shock to a person. So I think we have to prepare all of ourselves to have these conversations. We have to model it. We have to pray, and we have to be present to people. And somehow we have to, as it sounds like you're doing, muddle through that difficult liminal phase of being present to someone, even if their behaviors or the things they say and do are let's say, not helpful, whatever that means. I think we just have to find ways to be present to people in their difference and diversity, and create a safe space so that when they're ready, they're able to make that step, and they'll have a loving community around them to offer them support in the midst of that.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Daniel, so much. Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, the Cheryl is back, I understand. Is that right? To finish your thought.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened.
No, it's fine. Fine.
Technology took over. And so I was just saying that this is, I think, a timely resource for the church, that it gives us an opportunity to be human in the world in a way that models God, and God active in our lives where we are. In the state that we're in this of our mental health or mental illness or whatever's happening with us, that God is real and present in the midst of it. And I see that as being an incredible part of this. My only pet peeve would be, instead of self-care, I'd love to see soul care as that broader care of our whole being. Because the world puts such a meaning on that self-care, and so soul care, I'd love to see that word there as self-care, soul care. But all the things that you had to say are yes. This is what we need. This is a gift to the church, and this is an area of mission. This is a mission field right now. I mean, if in Jesus' time it was, people had leprosy. The time now, this is mental health, is trauma and brokenness, and all of these issues that are so many times intangible, but so real.
Yeah.
And so this is an incredible resource. So thank you. Thank you for this ministry. And I will be in touch.
I'm counting on it. Please, all of you, be in touch. I'd love to hear from you.
Beginning. Well, thank you, Sharon, very much. Daniel, other questions online or in present? Come. I have to repeat it because other people can't hear you online. Thank you. I don't want to paraphrase what you have to say, Tricia. I'm not. Self-care.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm wondering if this is a course that could be done outside of the church. I'm thinking with a group of other parents. Would it be appropriate? Or is this really something that should be done within the church or even within the confines of those who are followers of Christ?
Yeah, it really depends a lot on the community. I was up in Manitoba last week in Winkler, and 95% of the population are Christians in Winkler. Like, can you imagine that? Just anyway, from being from Britain, that's a remarkable statistic. So I think it depends on the expectations of the group. So we would say, and there are people who are not yet believers who have used the Sanctuary course and found it incredibly helpful, and it's also helped them on their journey of walking with the church and hopefully walking to Christ. And we know churches that have said that countless times. People came in from the community because they want to hear about mental health. And I guess they're also interested, like, what does God think about this subject? Because there's a lot of often sadly justified perceptions out there that the church doesn't always do a great job with this subject. And I'm not down on the church. I'm a minister. My wife is a minister. We love the church. We're very involved in it. But I think we've got to be honest and say we haven't always done a great job. So I have seen this work in a range of environments, but the bottom line is, we say at Sanctuary, anyone can use the course, but for our vision of well-being, for our vision of ultimate health, God's part of the picture. I don't think it's possible for a human being to truly be well without Christ. So we unashamedly, that is part of the narrative or part of the journey of the Sanctuary course. But every session looks at each subject from 3 lenses. So it looks at things from a clinical lens, a social lens, what does society tell us is happening here? And it looks at it from a theological lens. So I actually think in a non-faith-based environment, I suspect it would be intriguing for people to engage in the spiritual component and to hear how the church frames it. So I think it works, but it really depends on your friends understanding that, you know, a third of the content is going to be talking about what does the Christian faith have to speak to this subject.
Pat, you want to come up? Tricia Milman, Director of DCBC Baptist. Tell them what you do, Pat. Because it's a longer title.
Yeah, it is a longer title. I'll take suggestions for shortening it. So I serve as the Associate General Secretary for Transition Ministries and Women in Ministry with American Baptist Churches USA. Thanks again for your very informative and helpful presentation. I have 2 points of a question, and you could address either one or both of them together. So I was curious, you had mentioned the 3 Mile an Hour God book with Kosuke Koyama, and I'm curious about the role of PACE in our overall mental health and soul care, to pick up from my sister. Love is at the pace of 3 miles an hour, but so in our COVID culture, increase in technology, sometimes the information overload and the degree to which we have access to so much can really create a frenzied and overwhelming pace. And I'm just curious about what you see in how that impacts our overall health. And along with that, you had really wonderfully emphasized the relationality of our beings. And so I'm curious about your reflecting on the way in which Zoom and other technologies have both, on the one hand, enhanced connections, and on the other hand, there's a certain vapidness, or at least not the same kind of depth as with in-person connections. Just so curious about pace, curious about connections.
Very good. Yeah, well, I mean, all technology has to be stewarded. If you just leave it to itself, the tail wags the dog. So I think I'm really grateful that the global pandemic happened at a time where we had technology that could facilitate some semblance of connection. But the danger, obviously, to state the obvious, is that now in a post-pandemic world, or what we hope is at the moment a post-pandemic world, may it continue, that we don't just continue on that path. If the incarnation teaches us anything, presence matters, and looking into someone's eyes matters, and physical touch matters. All of that, God has made us fearfully and wonderfully to need these things. So I would say, as I think you are implicitly in the question, we have to be really cautious about how much we let technology dictate the nature of our relationships, because yeah, I think that's something we're going to have to fight for increasingly. Particularly, I think of the use of screens, personal screens. Ultimately, we have huge tech organizations dictating the nature of our relationships, and I don't think that sounds great. So we have to think about how we steward these things. Also, I think, given in a place of languishing, which, as I said, I think humanity kind of took a collective step towards languishing during the pandemic. Addictions, or you could even call them habits which become addictions, are ways we try to soothe our pain. It's the way we try to soothe what we're lacking. So very often, the one thing that many of us are at risk, if not addicted to, are these, because we can immediately numb ourselves with them. We can just scroll and look at stuff to fill our minds. And I'm not anti-technology, I'm very grateful for it, but I think we have to ask the stewardship question. When we were coming out of the pandemic-ish, I remember feeling like my own capacity was limited. And I said to one of my colleagues, a member of my staff, I said, I'm sorry, I'm not quite with it. I'll get back up to speed soon. I think I've just got this kind of COVID lag, and I'll be back up to the speed I was at before. And my colleague stopped and looked at me and said, Dan, I don't think we were ever supposed to go at that speed. I think if there's one thing the pandemic's revealed, is that I think we were heading in a really bad direction, which is that our identity was attached to what we do and produce. And somehow that gets into the church and it becomes, actually, without meaning to, becomes part of the narrative of our faith, that we really do buy into that cultural perspective. And I think we have to fight hard to push back against it. We have to fight hard to slow down and to advocate for slowing down, because I think that's the speed of love, and that's worth it. And that's a radical, prophetic, countercultural message. Slow down, connect.
I guess my question, I'll preface it a little bit. Did he go off? There he is. All right. That confirms the spirit is still in the room, huh? But I think about, from the tradition where I serve and minister, that when I want to get our church to become more generous as a pastor, I have to preach about it. They reject it initially. If I want to get them into missions, I have to preach about it, usually in some kind of series. And I guess I'm leading up to the question that if churches as a whole, and I know some of this work is going to go on outside the church, but if churches as a whole are really going to get serious about the mental health issue, what do you think about a challenge for pastors to preach about mental health? You know, like in Mark chapter 9, that's probably a real severe case of mental health, when a young man, is cutting himself and doing all kinds of things. But I think there are several passages in the Bible that speak to it that we've already preached, but we didn't put mental health in the sermon.
Yeah.
But it was a mental health. So I just want to know what your view is maybe on that, with you being a preacher also and your wife.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, we absolutely need to find ways to talk about this from the pulpit. And one little clue I'll give you: you're looking for a sermon series, focus on the Psalms of Lament for a season. Just stay in the Psalms of Lament. The song, 40% of the songbook of the Bible, the songbook, are lament. They're just like, this is terrible. What's happening? Where are you, God? the songs I sing in my church are not 40% like that. So I think we need to do that. I think also when we look at Jesus, I think Jesus's own response to certain issues in public, whether it be turning tables, weeping over Jerusalem, whether it be weeping at the news of Lazarus, whether it be in the Garden of Gethsemane when he was under that crushing pressure, and whether it be when he's on the cross and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And more profound than God himself asking a question like that is that he gets no response. And in our culture, my cultural background, that's a difficult one, because the culture I've grown up in wants to wrap everything up in a neat bow. But there are people in our churches that have not had the answers they're looking for. And I think there is plenty of material in the scriptures to point to speak about this, and we should definitely do it.
So with your group, the Sanctuary, I just heard you just roll off a lot of passages as resources. So could that possibly be something that you could add to what you're doing? Just some passages pointing people in the direction, but they have opportunities to do series. Because you just opened my mind up talking about lamenting and all.
Yeah.
And I thought about when I was growing up more so maybe than now, we call it having the blues.
Yeah.
So I might preach a series on what to do when you got the blues. And they'll probably put me out, but anyway, I'd get a chance to.
No, it's great. Well, but you make a wonderful point that there are some cultures in the world that have a lot to teach Western culture about how to hold difficult subjects. And that's where in the course, one of the people who features in it is Reverend Dr. Cedric Johnson, who is a church planter, psychologist, musician. And he actually talks about that in the context of his interview. He talks about the role of music in his historical background, and just to draw on that is a resource. So we would love to do, I'm writing this down, create this. I'd love to do it in partnership with people though, because you're all preachers, and I'd love to hear from you. What are you digging around and finding in the scriptures? But we can create a list of passages that you can draw from, but we'd also love to hear what you're preaching as you come up with things as well.
Thank you so much, both Samuel and Daniel. When you talked about annotating the Bible, I thought when you came to the Psalms, it would be a multi-volume series because of exactly what you said, notion of lament. I think also going back to personal care, soul care, is that we have adopted, poor Rob has heard me say this so many times, Home Depot has a slogan, more saving, more doing, which seems to be the current theology in so many of our denominations. Rather than, right, sorry, but the issue and the essence of is more being and dwelling and listening and quiet and reflection. The other stuff is essential and important, absolutely, but it can't be the only things we ever get excited about. And this has been a challenge today, a remarkable challenge and a good challenge. That whole notion of not smiling in a year and one's vocation not being shared with family or with the Lord or anything else, Daniel, is really important and really disclosive and really essential. Thank you very, very much. Another question here. James. Who is one of the senior chaplains of the Baptist Caucus Canadian Armed Forces and has a lot of experience in this area.
The military dealing with shell shock back in World War I, World War II, later defined as PTSD. Some of the experiences that we discovered, one was to keep the individual close to his section or his unit. Give them something meaningful to do. So I think of Elijah as an excellent example of a mental breakdown, a mental, call it what you want. Call it, what do we call it when we're burnt out, stressed as pastors? It's a mental thing. We need to take some time. So when I'm thinking about the military in the context of support and the proximity to those who care for them, I'll tell you, you're in churches, you love each other. I have never seen more intense relational brotherhood, fraternity than in a morgue where soldiers come together and they weep for their fallen. The fraternity of the military is unmatched from my experience. Here's our thing with the military, and this will be a question for you. You know, we wait until the very end to get really help, and I'm kind of doing that myself. One, the stigma for the military leaders, you're trained to be tough and to go forward and accept that you need help. One of our lieutenant generals was sitting on a park bench after spending a night and a half, a day and a half away. He couldn't find him, and he was broken. He was General Romeo Dallaire, who went into Rwanda and dealt with he wrote a book, Shaking Hand with the Devil. And General Dallaire, broken, went forward and to get some help. Anytime he speaks about his situation, you still see he still has work to do. And I'd say we all continue to have work to do. Staying close to a proximity of caregivers sounds like what this support group is all about. My concern with this is, as a military chaplain, I have tremendous amount of resources where I can refer people. I'm not entirely sure, you know, we walk down DC and we see a lot of people going through, you know, they're out, and how do you get them connected with care? You'll never get a whole group of them into a Bible study or a care group like this. And then once you do, this is the real point, you know, where do you find the resources to get them real help? One pastor, he was a chaplain in the prison work in Canada, got overwhelmed and just challenged with prison ministry, and he went into retirement. Took a little church in Hamilton, Ontario, and not too long after that, he started to have prisoners seek him out as their ex-chaplain, and the group grew, and it ended up being the sexual offenders. So a lot of pedophiles. If you look at pedophilia in terms of the rehabilitation rate, the reoccurrences is around 60 to 80%. He maintained a support group. The community church gathered around him and support him, said, look, this is what the ministry is, this is where it's going. Okay, we're going to save our church, but this is going to be our ministry. And a group of 20 men have had next to no repeats. And I think it comes to your point about support in the social context, but also they're getting help. They're getting referred to caregivers that are professional. I am not a professional counselor, and so I know my limitations of directing people towards help. So the question for us is, you know, how do we in our church bodies, in our organizations, say, let's run a program, which is awesome, but how do we connect the fact that we're going to have a lot of people who have needs, and where are we going to put them financially? How do we support that? Thank you.
Yeah, huge question. I guess at the risk of sounding provocative, which is not my intention, is if the challenges are there, they'll come out some way. They'll either come out too late, as you've alluded to. That's one of the saddest things about Sanctuary's work. Is very often that when we get calls from a church, it's when something terrible has happened. It's when the pastor's child has died by suicide, and they had no idea. And that has happened in the last couple of years. It's when the worship pastor's died by suicide. So it's these horrendous situations that occur. I think you have to be an optimist in approaching this work, because I hear you, and it's completely overwhelming. Where do we even begin in this subject? Well, I think you begin with a sanctuary course, because my theory is if you can equip every single Christian in every single church to have a framework and a language, and to understand that the role of spiritual care and support is a vital component of care, you actually might catch some things early on, and that role of community will be the thing that people need. There are undoubtedly biomedical needs that require medical professionals, trained professionals. Of course, there absolutely are, and the system is broken. What we need ideologically is a system that incorporates all of these aspects of care into one. We need your doctor, your psychologist, your therapist, your nutritionist, and your pastor in the same room.
For emphasis.
and in Vancouver to do that, to create a circle of care around someone in the midst of crisis. So that is going to happen.
You'll look up a guy called Stuart Kennedy, but he's known as Woodbine Willie. And if you just look up Woodbine Willie, he was a chaplain in the First World War who wrote poetry that matches the psalmist in terms of despair. He used to give out cigarettes that were woodbines. That's why he was called Woodbine Willie. And he was a prophetic and amazing individual. There's a poem about Jesus going to Birmingham, England, and being ignored and leaning against a wall and weeping because he'd been marginalized by the culture he came to minister to. So if you want a 20th century chaplain or version of the psalmist, try Woodbine Willie. Again, those two courses are able to sign up. Yvonne's and Steve's as well. Any further questions? Unmuting yourself online or any from the room. These are excellent questions, folks, just excellent.
I just have one closing.
Please do. Go in here, my friend.
I was thinking about it and pardon me, Elijah, for using you as an illustration. But when Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine, I got a text from Elijah stating that he was preparing to go and pray with Ukrainian Baptist leaders, probably other church leaders. It was before the bombing started. And as much as I was concerned about Elijah going in that window, I thought about his wife and family. So I called a prayer meeting of our denomination to pray about what was going on in Ukraine. But in particular, I had a group praying for his family, because we fail to realize many times that the stress of our families and the prolonged stress in situations like this creates trauma for them. And so I think support groups would be excellent, because it would have been great if I would have known a group to call that could have reached out to his wife while he was in Ukraine. And I think Elijah left, and I don't know what, 72 hours after he left, the bombing started. And we were working with the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews before the National Baptist Convention of America. And they were preparing to help us with Rabbi Eckstein, who's now deceased, because of the amount of trauma that takes place in Israel, especially among the young people, with all of the bombings, and they have to go be in the military and all of that, and how well many of them are handling it because of the services that are provided to them. And I'm sure before we end the day, we're going to hear about some more services provided. But I think that is the other part of my final question. If I, as a pastor, do a series of sermons on lamenting and mental health, I need to have a follow-up for that, for the members who are now concerned about it. Yeah. So I know there's the sanctuary, and hopefully we'll find some other places that we can go or direct our members to, because most of them don't want to go initially to a counselor. Yeah. If there's some virtual platform, they'll probably do that first, get diagnosed, and then maybe they might go to something else. So you might know of some other resources, or maybe the resources are already under your platform.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of resources. I think that a couple of things spring to mind immediately. One is ongoing peer support groups for people who are living with mental health challenges or with a mental illness. There are organizations like Grace Alliance in the US and Texas, and there are a couple of others that offer peer support training so that you can run peer support groups just to get people in that space of talking to each other openly in an ongoing way. What the Sanctuary course will do is it'll help your whole congregation begin a conversation that allows everyone to know why this is an important subject and the need to get help as we identify that. So I think peer support groups is another one in an ongoing way. Much like a 12 steps group, it's just a group that creates space for people to be seen and heard by each other. But secondly, there is some really cool work going on. I think in Hamilton, in Ontario, there's an organization called the Shalane Network, and there are a couple of others doing this. And they will allow congregations to buy a certain amount of hours of therapy. So you could buy like 200 hours of therapy, and then you can let your congregation know it exists. And then members of your congregation, as they feel led or prompted, they don't need to go through you. They can go direct to that care to talk to a therapist online. So again, for people who are maybe feeling a bit scared or stigmatized about doing that, coming to see the pastor or coming to talk with someone, you can actually do that. And as well as that, you can also create a list of therapists that you feel are good therapists, either from your congregation or the area, whether they be Christian therapists, whatever. You can compile a list and say to people, look, here's a list of people that we believe are good at what they do. So I think there's a few things you can do in an ongoing way. Yeah.
I see that 11 comments in the chat. I don't know if those are questions or not.
No, just comments. Thank you. I think maybe we can talk more, Daniel, about maybe a webinar, doing a walkthrough about practical applications and settling in, if you're open to that, maybe in dialogue with some of the things that Samuel is raising. So how do we preach? How do we walk? I just think that it was important, since Jim mentioned Elijah, the one in the Kings, not the one present, almost broken. After his experience with the prophets of Baal, he went to the mountain. He's asked to go to the mountain, and there was a wind, terrifying wind, shattered rocks and all that kind of stuff. Our circumstances are varied and intense and frightening. And then there was an earthquake. And then there was a fire. But the Lord was not in any of those things. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, sheer silence, presence of God. So I trust two things: that we dwell in the sheer silence, the gentle whisper, that being one thing, Elijah's experience. And we this day commit, encouraging one another even over lunch and virtually as you take a break, we do not turn away today, but we place our feet firmly planted in this excellent time. Daniel, any last comments from you?
No, my only last comment would be to say that I really believe the church can do this. I really believe if we can have these conversations, we can actually place the church at the forefront of caring for this subject in society. And the implications for that are far bigger than our congregations. It's about redeemed and restored communities. I'm actually in the course of writing a book, allegedly, for SPCK in Britain. And one of the things I'm going to be drawing on is the rich history of the church meeting needs at points of crises in the pre-welfare state world. And I think this is ahead of us. This is an opportunity and a moment that God is giving us. And I really believe we can do it. So I'll be praying for you. And I'm very, very grateful and humbled for the chance to speak with you today. So God bless you. Please be in touch. Please get in touch if you want to hear any more.
Daniel, we are excited and encouraged by the work. We are deeply thankful for you.